Hello, apes, and welcome to the sixth in our screencast series for Chapter 3. And we're going to leave extinction and evolution behind, and we are now going to go into talking about ecology and the levels of ecology. And again, this is going to be a review for you because we covered this in general biology and maybe a little bit in honors biology towards the end. So this is something that you would have had before. But when we think about ecology and evolution, they're connected. They're tightly intertwined together because of the area that we live in. So I have in my classroom some nesting dolls, and if you had my general biology class, you've seen these nesting dolls before, and I'll pull them out again, and I use them to kind of give an example of the levels of organization that we have within our ecosystem. So the earth that we live in, all the living things on the earth and the areas that are inhabited is referred to the biosphere. So that includes the living and the non-living, and it's everything. And you heard me say, and I'm going to write this here on the screen, that this is a closed system where everything within here is recycled. It's reused. We don't lose anything to the system. We might lose a little bit of heat, but we really don't lose any of the nutrients or matter within the system. So from the biosphere, we can drop down, and I know that this is not in your book, but I want to include this on here. In the biosphere, we can break this down into biomes. And biomes are distinct areas that have similar climate conditions, similar chemistry of the water, soil conditions, similar dominant plant species and dominant animal species that inhabit that area. There's about 11 different biomes that make up the biosphere. Okay, so we have biomes. The next thing that we have, and again, not listed on this, is we go from, we do have it on here, I'm just not reading ahead. We go from biomes to ecosystems. And ecosystems are going to be communities. Communities are going to be individuals of interacting species, different interacting species that live in a same area, but we're going to have several different communities that are going to be living in an area, interacting with a non-living material and the forces that they interact with. So we're going to think about interdependencies, and interrelationships that exist within these areas. So what I just mentioned, all of this is what makes up that biosphere, that living space. The community interaction is really important because there's going to be different populations that make up that community. It could be plant populations, it could be a primary consumer, which would be an herbivore that would feed off of the plants. It could be a carnivore that feeds off of that herbivore. And there's going to be distinct relationships that are going to shape that ecosystem. And when we study ecology, we need to understand all of those interdependencies and interrelationships. So here we go. This is the breakdown. They've left out the biomes in between biosphere and ecosystem, but this is the level of organizations that it would go into. The biosphere, as I said, is going to be that sum total of everything, the living and the non-living area that we live in. That biosphere is made up of biomes. Remember, we had that written in there. And those biomes contain ecosystems, where these are functional systems. They consist of communities. These communities interact with the living and the non-living environment, and there's interdependencies that go on within those interactions. Interdependencies because they need certain things that those ecosystems provide. So if it's an aquatic ecosystem, is it saltwater? Is it providing the saltwater for it to survive? Is it a freshwater ecosystem? So does it have the components that make up a freshwater ecosystem that are needed to survive? Temperature, all of those things. So a community then is a set of populations of different species that live together in a particular area. So as I'm looking at this picture, I'm seeing a turtle population. And I don't know the names of all these fish, but I'm seeing 1, 2, 3, at least 3 different fish species. And then this is a type of coral. I'm seeing some other corals and maybe some aquatic plants that are in this, I'm going to say it's a coral reef ecosystem or community that we have here. So we get a combinations of different species that live together, and guess what? They depend on each other. That turtle probably is going to feed off some of the plant life that's at the bottom. There's probably other fish that's going to feed off of the algae that happens to be there. I'm getting all of this mail here. Then when we look at communities, remember I said that they're made up of populations. So a population would be a group of individual species that live in a particular area. So a population, look at all of these turtles, these sea turtles that happen to be there. They're kind of hard to see, but there's other ones. And then organisms, and that's an individual living thing. So this is our level of organization that we rely on. So, what we do with this is we look at the populations, and we call this population ecology because we want to see how or what the dynamics of these populations are and what causes populations to change. So we would consider the factors that affect them, maybe their distribution, where are they located, or the abundance. Let's see how many of these organisms do we have in this particular population. So that's some of the things that we will look at. We will look at what they depend on in that population, what they feed off of, how they interact with each other. We know that some populations, if we think of the chimps, they actually have a certain hierarchy where they have a monarch and a patriarch in their communities, and they have specific roles. And we look at that to try to understand why some of these populations might increase and why some of the populations might decrease. Community ecology is going to focus on the patterns and interactions of that diversity. How do they interact with each other? Predator-prey relationships. That's one of the things that we would look at within a community ecology. We would look at, was it commensalism, mutualism, that affects it, and as I already said, predator-prey relationships within that. Ecosystem ecology, this is where we're going to study the living and non-living components of these systems. This is where we're going to look at nutrient and energy flows, the biogeochemical cycles that I've mentioned a few times before. And we're going to see, how does carbon cycle through this system? How does phosphorus cycle through this system? How does what are the nutrient cycles, I should say, with this that are going to be there? And how do the organisms depend on those? How does the energy flow? Does it go from primary producers to herbivore to carnivore to omnivore? What's that level of flow? What's the food chains, the food webs? And we would be developing these kinds of things to understand our ecosystem ecology. In this, we're going to look at what does that organism need? And where it lives is referred to the habitat. That's the environment where that organism lives. So that habitat, as I've already mentioned, it includes the living and the non-living elements that are there. So the soil, the precipitation, the pH, the temperature range. Let's talk about the terrain. Is it mountainous? Is it flat? So those are the conditions that we would look at as far as the non-living elements. And then we would look at the living elements. What kind of plant species do we have in this area? How about insect species? Then we would look at our primary consumers. What are those primary consumers that are there? How about our secondary consumers, tertiary consumers? What kind of apex predators happen to live and interact in this area? And that brings us to habitat use, because each organism is going to thrive in a certain habitat, but it's not going to be able to survive in others. When I talked about that little lizard in Florida, they're all over Florida. Do we see them here? No. And why? Because we don't have that consistent warm temperature. We can get temperatures that go below freezing, and it's not going to thrive in those temperatures because it can't survive in those temperatures. So we look at anything that we can see and how the organism uses the environment, and we're looking for non-random patterns of use. So we're looking habitat, we're looking for the habits of use, what they rely on consistently. So again, that leads us to habitat selection. And this is the process by which organisms actively select the habitats in which they live. So they're looking for areas that are going to provide the basics, food, water, and shelter, and where they're going to be able to thrive the most. So the availability of the quality habitat is crucial to that organism's well-being, to its survival, because it needs those needs, it needs to have those needs met in order for it to be able to survive. So when we get humans to interact with this, and humans fragment the habitats, then this creates conflict in the process of those organisms being able to survive. And we have to understand our impact to those systems. I remember years ago when I first started teaching at Gwinnett, there's an area down the road called Penland Woods, and they were fighting to get Penland Woods to be built on. There were contractors that wanted to build on it. And they actually had people come out and study the area and found that the resources that it offered were too valuable to lose. And they never developed on it, and they protected that area of land. And we have places like that around, but we need to protect more area. And we need to use and build off of what we've already built on. And we can do that, and again, that's a topic for a later chapter. So habitats are going to vary with the body size and needs of a species. So if you're thinking of a soil mite, which is very tiny, almost microscopic, versus an elephant, that elephant's going to need much more area in order for it to survive and live than that tiny little soil mite that could probably survive in a square inch of soil. So we have to consider that when we're looking at habitat needs. We have to look at the different times that that organism might require that habitat. And we talk about migratory birds. They use different habitats during their migration from summer and winter. And we talked about the geese that were supposed to do that, but they don't. We're running out of time here. I'm going to pick up with species on the next screencast. All right, see you in a few.